All right, welcome back, everybody, to hour 3 of our psychedelic marathon. I feel kind of like Jerry Lewis in those old muscular dystrophy telethons towards the end, fighting hard to stay active. In this case, it's easy because we're talking about the most fascinating topics here. So I could talk about drugs, their impact on culture and wellness for hours. And this has been one of the most engaged and lively webinars, if not the most lively engaged webinar that Psychedelics Go and or Global Go have put on. So I just can't get over the quality of our content as well as our incredible engaged audience. And it's going to continue right now with our third and final webinar of the day, the road to monetization. I myself am a founder, entrepreneur, venture capitalist. I'm a 3-time public CEO. I'm based in Toronto, Canada, which has been, if you will, the wallet for first the cannabis industry and now very much the bankroll for the psychedelic industry. And this is a topic that I'm so interested to hear our panelists and our moderator navigate, because as an investor and as an industry observer and participant, I see many companies that have no clear path towards monetization. We'll call these the drug development companies. They're, as mentioned on earlier panels, on the FDA panel, they're a long tail strategy to hopefully get approval from their health authority to be able to have their molecules, their proprietary formulations approved as a medicine that a physician can prescribe with the full protection of their insurance. There's also, of course, the ketamine industry, which we covered quite thoroughly, although we could have gone on for a while. And of course, that is actually a cash flowing asset class within psychedelics. So that's just one of many types of companies. And we're going to start to explore some of the nuances and the differences and the options that are available out of the current legal landscape for both entrepreneur creators as well as for investors, whoever they may be, from independent investors to family offices to high net worth individuals to dedicated investment funds, which have popped up over the last couple of years. Helping us navigate this complex but fascinating area is our gifted moderator, Tom Zuber, the managing partner at Zuber, Lawler. I think it's fair to say one of the top law firms in America, period, full stop, but also with a real foundation in plant-based medicine, be it cannabis, where they were one of the first firms to see the potential and see the value of a top law firm could make, and very much into psychedelics. And Tom has an incredible education, including a law degree from a little school called Columbia, a master's from another little school called Harvard University, and if that wouldn't make his parents proud enough, a biomedical engineering degree from Rutgers University. So talk about fusing a whole bunch of things relevant to our topic today into one big brain. He's also the founder of International Psychedelics Consulting Company and our event host today, Psychedelics Go, as well as the magazine Psychedelia, and is also a founder of the cannabis advisory company Global Go. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone to Tom, and I look forward to hearing all of these brilliant panelists share their leadership thoughts. Take it away, Tom.
Thank you very much, Paul. Great to see you always, brother. And it's a pleasure to be speaking with all of you. I think this is a great topic, the road to monetization. It's obviously very timely. First, a little bit about myself, just in addition to what Paul had mentioned. Thank you for the very kind words, Paul. I will add one note, which is that psychedelics is a passion project, not just for myself, but for my law firm, my colleagues at Zuber, Lawler, and Psychedelics Go. We are just so excited about the potential of this subject matter to alleviate the human condition, physiological, psychological throughout the world. And so a big part of that, a big part of access around the world is monetization, because in my view, it doesn't happen as well. Access doesn't happen as well without monetization. So this, I think, is a very timely topic, and it's something that my colleagues and I are very passionate about. We have an outstanding panel here. First, I'd like to apologize because we did have, we were supposed to have 4 panelists. Our friend at MindCure, Kelsey Ramsden, cannot join us as a function of a last-minute note. So we certainly look forward to speaking with her at another time. But we do have an outstanding panel here. First, I'm going to go ahead and bring on the panelists, and I'll allow them to say a brief bit about themselves and their companies. as they come on. First, we have Greg McKee, CEO over at TRYP Therapeutics. Greg, you want to say a few words about yourself and TRYP?
Happy to. And Tom, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and for the opening comments. We're excited to hear, from the rest of the panelists earlier or here in a few minutes. Yeah, so just a couple of words on TRYP. So TRYP Therapeutics is publicly traded up on the Canadian Stock Exchange. So hats off to Paul's comments earlier about Toronto sort of being the initial wallet and backing of these companies, which has certainly been the case for us as well. We are focused on a couple of very unique areas for the use of psilocybin. We are looking specifically at chronic pain and also a couple of unique areas in the eating disorders arena. So we do have a novel chemistry that is psilocybin based, novel formulation, and also a novel route of administration that we're applying to a couple of very unique areas outside of kind of the traditional arena of classic mood disorders. So very excited to talk about that and also talk about how we see what our path to monetization looks like down the road.
That's wonderful. And next we have Zane Hassan. Zane, do you want to say a few words about yourself and of course about NueLife Health, where you are the co-founder and CMO? It looks like we lost connection with Zane Hassan. Oh, there he is. Zane, can you hear us? While Zane's getting connection, why don't we go ahead and introduce Robert Roscow. And Robert, if you could say a few words about yourself. You're the Chief Scientific Officer at Mydecine. So if you could also say a few words about the great work that Mydecine is doing in the space, that would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom. And thank you for inviting me to the panel today. I'm really excited to talk about monetization in the space. And so I'm Robert Roscow. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of Mydecine Innovations Group. And really, Mydecine is a company focused on first looking at indications with Generation 1 psychedelics. So specifically, we have clinical trials with psilocybin launching in next year for PTSD and also smoking cessation with a partnership with Johns Hopkins. And then secondarily, we're looking at novel chemistry to really improve safety, efficacy, and usability in a medical context for psilocybin-like molecules. So great to be here and to talk with everybody today.
Thank you very much, Robert. Great to have you here. And Zane, can you hear us? Zane, are you with us?
Yes, Tom, I'm sorry. I'm having a little some internet connectivity issues. Internet.
Okay, wonderful. Let's give it a shot, Zane, if we can.
Tom, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, we can. And if you want to say, Zane, a few words about yourself and the work that you're doing in the space, that would be wonderful. Of course, with a nod also to your role as CMO and co-founder of NueLife.
Of course. So my name is Dr. Hassan. I'm the Chief Medical Officer and co-founder of NueLife, as you mentioned, and we are building a digital platform for innovative mental health therapies, including at-home sublingual ketamine, and building digital tools for patients and providers. Wonderful. So I'd love to speak the work that we do around data and the implications there around accessibility, and we'll get into all of the different paths to monetization there.
Thank you very much, Zane. And Zane, it's great to have you with us, and thank you for working through the technical difficulties. So again, I'm very excited about this topic, and I think in some ways, in terms of increasing access to this subject matter, psychedelics, and its potential to alleviate the human condition throughout the world, I think that this is first on the list in terms of helping to make that happen, helping to make that access happen. So on the topic of monetization, first, for newcomers to the psychedelics commercialization conversation, let's start with some basics. And Rob, if you could start us off, that would be great. We're talking about monetizing Schedule I substances here. Schedule I substances are purportedly, by definition, lacking any verified medical benefit. So leaving ketamine aside for a moment, how does one monetize a Schedule I psychedelic substance?
Absolutely. So it's a great question. And I think it's kind of highlights a misconception in the space that, if something is Schedule I, it's barred from research. And so really what we can do is look at these as clinical trial drugs of interest and really run them through the same clinical trial scheme that you would think of with a normal, new prototype pharmaceutical. And so that's the general avenue that's available, and that's much more available than I think people currently appreciate. However, there is an additional layer with it being Schedule 1 that not only is this a FDA regulatory question, it also then becomes monitored and regulated by the DEA as well. And there's an additional layer of licensure that's necessary there. But this is not outside of the normal sort of scheme that you would see in clinical trials in other areas of drug development.
Very good. And so let's stay, if we could, just for the audience's perspective here, on the topic of Schedule 1 substances. Zane, for the audience's sake, can you talk a bit about the process of moving a compound from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, and what are the ramifications of that type of movement from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3?
Absolutely. Well, let's look at MAPS. So MAPS has been funded entirely through $130 million of philanthropic donations over 35 years. Recently, they actually announced the creation of a novel social impact SPV, the Regenerative Financing Vine, that will infuse another $70 million into that process to develop patient access infrastructure and research for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. The MAPS treatment actually cost, the MDMA-assisted therapy cost $19,000 per patient. So they've taken, MDMA through, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, now expanded clinical access, trials. So phase 1, largely safety data. And then, when you get to, phase 3, you're looking at, safety and efficacy in larger populations. Obviously this is an extremely costly, process to go through the FDA path. Now, what is the, the likelihood of MAPS getting this treatment reimbursed? MAPS published a cost-benefit analysis demonstrating the return on investment in patient outcomes. So every 1,000 patients treated, MAPS estimates a 30-year savings to the medical care system of $103 million, while generating 5,053 QALYs. So QALYs are quality-adjusted life years, and averting 43 deaths in that process. So, this is the data that you take to payers and you demonstrate, whether it's to your large insurance companies, self-insured companies, or accountable care organizations, really, if you can demonstrate those cost savings, they will probably be able to get, insurance reimbursement in their model. Now, they still have yet to raise $150 million in the next 3 years to complete their clinical trials. MAPS reports that they have enough money to finish the trials in the US, Israel, and Canada. The next $150 million will go to covering commercialization expenses. So they've hired BCG to develop their go-to-market strategy, and they believe that $70 to $80 million will be set aside for commercialization before the drug is approved. Another $35 to $40 million will be set aside for phase 3 clinical trials in Europe. They have some interesting, monetization, paths. So they have a lot of partnerships, and one partnership with Wasana, which really focuses on psychedelics in TBI populations. So they are effectively getting a cash payment for the contributions of the safety data that MAPS will be generating for them. And then once they're able to expand the indication of MDMA in the TBI population, they'll do a revenue share. So in kind of this cost analysis,
Zane, we're losing you a bit there. So I'm gonna, my apologies to the audience. Obviously, we're apologize for the technical difficulties here, and hopefully you bear with us. Greg, let's go ahead and move on to, let's start off, Greg. by noting that there's a lot of parallels. There are a lot of parallels, obviously, between what's occurring in the psychedelics industry and what's already happened in the cannabis industry, right? But there are some major differences too. And so one of those differences, it seems that we might focus on, potential differences, is the level of legalization at the recreational level, the adult use level in the cannabis industry. And how does that sort of precedent translate to the psychedelics industry, where it seems like we're moving in a more clinical direction, right? Where administration of you're not going to be able to walk into a psychedelic shop and buy some LSD and to be able to go and enjoy that in your home the way that you enjoy a smoke ball that you purchased out of a cannabis shop. So what will the relationship be between administration sites and drug development companies? What will that relationship look like? Will each company need to build out their own treatment clinics in order to offer products to the public?
Right. It's a great train of thought, Tom, and it's going to be really interesting to watch how this kind of unfolds. But you're right. There's going to likely need to be a certain type of relationship that occurs between drug development companies and clinics, hospitals, and other organizations that ultimately actually treat these patients. There's clearly a couple of different ways that can happen, right? And there's already a couple of good examples of how that's occurred in the oncology space, right? With infusion centers, say for example, where drug companies have obviously spent lots of time going through the clinical trial process, as Zane was just describing a little bit ago, and then either partnering with a large pharma company or going direct to market, but then essentially treating patients at infusion centers or clinics or hospitals where they're not actually providing the hardware or the medical devices to infuse their patients, or they're not actually treating their patients, but they are providing the drug. So in a similar fashion, certainly for cases like ours at TRYP Therapeutics and other companies that are working on therapeutic doses that will typically require patients to enter the psychedelic state for a period of time, then very likely these sessions are going to be occurring at specialty clinics or in unique hospital settings. So a couple things could happen. One thing that may occur that certainly we've been thinking about at TRYP is that we may partner with a large pharma company that's got great distribution capabilities. That would be one kind of natural traditional biotech kind of approach in terms of how a smaller company might commercialize something. We certainly also though have thought about commercializing product on our own, and for us to do that, then we could envision potentially partnering with an organization that had deep access to broad numbers of clinics in North America, and also potentially then in larger markets like in Europe, Latin America, and in Asia. And that may be a different set of partners for different geographies. It might be one global firm, depending on what happens with those organizations that are building out infrastructure. But at some point, we could potentially, partner our drug, with them and have some sort of collaboration where there is a joint effort to make sure that there's access, and then also, all the way through the follow through in terms of, payment from payers and so forth. So there's certainly a couple of different paths that we see where we could monetize, our drugs, and certainly having the right type of relationship in a situation like this, where you've got a psychedelic drug that's typically coupled with psychotherapy, that there will likely need to be a strong relationship then with those, especially clinics that are providing access to patients.
Greg, that's so helpful. Greg, let me poke at one thing that you had mentioned there. Our law firm, Zuber Lawler, does a lot of work with pharmaceutical companies and with psychedelics companies. One question I have for you is, how does that work if TRYP were to, for instance, form an alliance with a pharmaceutical company? How does that benefit TRYP in terms of the need for, let's say, a clinical context in order to administer products, right? So
right.
These pharmaceutical companies are product companies as well.
Yeah, it will be interesting to watch how that plays out, right? Like from our perspective, I think that we anticipate being in a position to take this all the way to market, on our own. But as you pointed out, and as probably have seen very often in life science space, very very many times, smaller companies, early stage development companies like TRYP will partner with a larger pharma company. Typically, that relationship involves essentially access to larger amounts of capital, as well as certain types of clinical development infrastructure for large global trials, say, for example, and then ultimately market prowess, market access, and marketing dollars to really, push product into, multiple jurisdictions, multiple geographies. Along the way, it'll be interesting to see what pharma does. So the traditional biotech pharma relationship, could come to bear. However, there's a whole new component that needs to likely be included in this, which are these specialty sites, these locations where patients will actually, be dosed with psychedelics and need to be monitored for extended periods of time, right? A lot of pharmaceutical companies don't necessarily have access to that. So that could be a partnership or a relationship that we bring to the table to Big Pharma. We may come to them with a full solution already baked, right, for example, or it may be something where certain pharma companies decide to build some of their own relationships, or they add that on to the relationship at a later point. So there's a couple different ways that can happen, but certainly it's really clear from this position that there's a number of different components that need to come together to make this total solution work for patients, including the drug, global marketing expertise, as well as access to specialty clinics that work uniquely with psychedelic drugs. So all those things need to come together. But I think that the industry will easily and readily figure out a solution with all those players to make this most effective for patients, which frankly, at the end of the day, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, very exciting. Thank you, Greg. I have an open question for the panel. Now, of course, there are some audience members that are already familiar with the compounds that you're commercializing, but let's assume nobody has any clue what TRYP is doing, what Mydecine is doing, and what NueLife is doing. Can you talk about what compounds you're actively commercializing and or developing today? And that's an open question for the panel.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to jump in there and explain what Mydecine's work is. And so our first generation of psychedelic work is all based around purified psilocybin. And so this is what's going into our PTSD clinicals, as well as the smoking cessation work with Johns Hopkins that I mentioned earlier. And then we have a strong interest in novel chemistry around both the combination of MDMA and psilocybin, and then novel iterations of both of those categories of drugs. And so this is really where our long-term R&D chemistry is. But to sort of address the topic of the call today, the road to monetization, we've really seen this as a two-step approach where we can leverage the current outstanding clinical data, such as is put out by Dr. Johnson at Johns Hopkins, and move into later stage clinical trials and use that as a stepping stone to, as it was mentioned earlier, employ the longer timeline to these novel solutions, which we think will actually really address some of the issues that Greg was just mentioning, because they are targeting things like shorter activity time to make it so that patients don't need to be monitored for as long, for instance. I think these things, it's sort of a multi-stage process, but we'll see really strong benefits in that category.
Very exciting, Robert. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in if that's okay, and we just kind of add to what Robert mentioned there a minute ago. So at TRYP, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're also focused on psilocybin, which of course is the prodrug, in that combination with psilocin being the active ingredient. So we also believe that there's a lot of room to improvement around a consistent experience for patients, and tighter control over the dosing schedule to ultimately have a stronger and more durable effect for patients. So we're working on a very novel formulation. We also believe that out of all the kind of standard routes of administration, so the audience I'm sure can envision, sub-Q or IM injections, for example, sublingual formulations, nasal, IV, of course, oral is the current standard, or even a patch, right? So of all that kind of that basket of traditional delivery methodologies, we think there's a couple that are really unique that provide the right types of dosing with faster onset of action, much more consistent experience for patients, and potentially a shorter duration in the psychedelic state that will still have a durable effect. So our novel formulation and that novel route of administration that we're looking at is what we'll be taking to the market, coupled with traditional psychotherapy. Our initial clinical trials with the University of Michigan in fibromyalgia and in binge eating disorder at the University of Florida, as well as a couple of other studies that we're working on in phantom limb pain, complex regional pain syndrome, and also in hypothalamic obesity, are using an off-the-shelf oral psilocybin to test the simple hypothesis of whether or not psilocybin works effectively. We think it will, and we think there's a strong rationale, but what we're going to take to market is a much more refined psilocybin-based compound.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Greg. And Zane, do you care to share as far as what you're up to at NueLife?
Yeah, I have probably the simplest answer to this. We are not in drug discovery, but we are building a molecule agnostic digital platform that maximizes the therapeutic benefit and essentially, is focused on the data science of all of these therapies. So we are very much interested in the parameters of the experience that portend the best clinical outcomes. So we track things like the mystical experience questionnaire, and we look at the intensity and the adverse event reporting out of like all of the ketamine experiences. So we've treated over 2,000 patients, facilitated over 10,000 experiences, and we're looking at the parameters that are optimized for durable clinical outcomes. That includes adjunctive therapy, precision medicine, looking at genomics and advanced lab testing, and really understanding like what are the baseline characteristics for the different people that account for the variability in experiences and the long-term outcomes. So we hope to present the data very similar to the way that MAPS has created their ROI on the the quality metrics, like the kind of the adjusted quality life years that like we accomplish for our patients. So I think that there's going to be a few molecules that we're very interested in. So there's a company called Progressive Therapeutics that is looking at a different on-ramp through to FDA indications. So Progressive Therapeutics is led by Dr. Phil Wolfson of the Ketamine Training Center. He's written the ketamine papers and very much psychedelically informed ketamine care, and he's interested in addressing the large women's health market, and he's found ketamine to be very helpful in PMS, and so he's relying on the phase 1 and phase 2 FDA clinical data for S-ketamine, and looking to similar to how S-ketamine has an FDA label for treatment-resistant depression through Janssen Pharmaceutical, develop a method of use patent for PMS. So really, the incentive to go through that process is to be able to control the the distribution of these medications through the traditional pharma route. And so I think it incentivizes developing high quality clinical evidence where your average primary care physician will feel comfortable prescribing it. I think that's going to largely address the access to care issue. But as long as off-label use remains cash based, then you have to rely on anything else you can do to to close the gap of how much patients can afford to receive this therapy. So that's where we're focused on, and the telemedicine at home model has significantly driven down the cost. The average cost of IV ketamine treatment is around $4,000. That's around $600 per treatment. So we've been able to drive it down to around $200 per treatment. And that includes the 4 months of telemedicine care, all of the adjunctive therapies that we know are important, psychedelically informed preparation and integration groups, health coaching that kind of walks people through lifestyle interventions that are going to be important to have a persistent outcome. A lot of these things are not covered by traditional CPT codes, and we've spoken or I've heard other panelists speak about that before, the development of psychedelically informed CPT codes. So there's a long way to go in getting this covered, but I think just driving down the cost is the primary means to access at this point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, Zane. And Zane, why don't we stick with you here? I'd like to talk about insurance, which is on a lot of folks' minds. How will reimbursement roll out for psychedelics, for psychedelic drug companies? The treatment programs occur to facilitate succinctness as to what it could be a very large question. Let's take a specific compound like MDMA. What's the pathway to reimbursement by insurance for MDMA, and how would we pursue it?
Right. I think it comes back to that ROI on that $19,000 sticker price per patient. Looking at the $100 million cost savings, for the thousands of patients that you're treating. I think that would have to be the ultimate salient point for insurance companies to consider, is that there is going to be a tremendous cost savings in saved medical care medical costs. So once people are able to, kind of, get on board with the clinical efficacy, then it'll be the development of CPT codes. So CPT codes are just jargon for, all of the medical services that healthcare providers perform. And if we're able to, create CPT codes for psychedelic integration, then, those will be reimbursable by your typical health insurers. So I believe MAPS is working on getting those, accepted. And then once we have FDA label indication, then really, any thoughtful provider can prescribe that in a safe clinical context. So
thank you, Zane. Very, very helpful. And Greg, I'd like to stay on the same topic for a bit, or at least a related topic. Given that most therapies will be co-administered with psychotherapy, will that complicate payers' view in terms of paying for treatment sessions?
It certainly adds another layer to it, for sure, right? There'll need to be a little bit of justification, as we were talking about there earlier, in terms of the value that's brought to the table, though I think that's going to be demonstrated in clinical studies, right? The durability likely will be much better when drugs are coupled with psychotherapy. At least that's the current, kind of belief of the industry, which I think will bear out in trials. So there'll be another, layer of data that's analyzed by the payers. There'll be another analysis in terms of, what actually benefit is being provided to patients. But I think at the end of the day, it's not terribly complex. The industry overall is quite used to working in complex solutions for patients. And ultimately, if the therapeutic approach of the combination of a drug plus psychotherapy, is episodically, used. So say, for example, let's say we're treating patients once, maybe a couple times a year, and that effect's fairly durable, and the impact, like we were talking, previously about the qualities, are significant, then I think that we'll find that the payers will be, they'll see the value for the members of their networks, and they'll be willing to agree to the right type of pricing model that will work for the industry overall.
Thank you, Greg. Let's move over to alliances, meaning institutional alliances, and the role that institutional alliances has in developing the psychedelics industry. Let's go to Rob for that. Rob, what do you think of the partnership between MAPS and Numinous as an example of that type of institutional alliance? And are you leveraging institutional alliances like that to accelerate and facilitate the development and commercialization of your own products?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think these sorts of alliances are instrumental in really gaining, broader acceptance and respect within the medical community. Because as groups, join together, produce better research, et cetera, it's going to move the whole field forward. And so this is something that we at Mydecine have been really, leaving as a goal for us in all of our relationships. And so if you look at our clinical trial partners, really what we've done there is go out and try to find the best institutions to partner with, not only for the clinical trial aspect, like I was mentioning with our relationship with Johns Hopkins, but also then thinking about where are we running these clinical trials, and can they act as an example for what Greg was just mentioning? If we're running these in a larger hospital network or system, can that act as a test case for the types of improvements that have been mentioned earlier on the call? One thing I'd also add with this too is that related to what we were just talking about, one thing that will, I think, really improve the acceptance of this, and this can be also leveraged through institutional alliances, is by making the actual treatment much more similar to what's already accepted as mental health therapies, and especially as far as time course and set and setting in the facilities. And so this is something I think that we'll see both the institutional alliances carry forward, and then also research in the space.
Thank you very much, Rob. And Greg, let's move to a slightly different topic now. Given that there are many similarities between various psychedelic drugs in development, is there any concern that approved treatments will potentially be undermined via off-label use of other compounds?
It's a really interesting line of thought. At this point, I think that we're not terribly concerned about that, at least from our perspective, although there's always a possibility of that, right? In that, even though there's quite a few, companies that you mentioned in the industry and some similarities in terms of the chemistries that are being developed, and the formulations are fairly closely packed, it seemed in certain, areas. each one of these companies, each of us are going to have to generate, unique data in these patient populations in certain jurisdictions. There is a lot of challenges to actually use drugs off-label. I mean, the physicians are taking certain types of risk if there's not data generated with the exact chemistry, right, for certain patient populations. And then on top of that, you've got the whole question that we were just discussing now, which is how will it get paid for? And off-label drugs aren't typically, paid for out of traditional CPT codes. So that will be, two different barriers to entry for industry players are trying to, navigate around other companies that have actually generated data in certain areas. So I think that you're going to see a little bit of sorting out in terms of, one, which chemistries are working best in certain therapeutic areas, and then two, I think that we're going to see a much broader set of patients treated. I think that if you really consider the potential of unleashing the full capabilities of psychedelic drugs, I think that you'll see more chemistries and each one of them will begin to find unique therapeutic areas where they've got the best efficacy and safety track records. And it's those compounds that will sort of lead the way. I think a lot of other things will kind of fall, behind that, unless those companies go through, the effort to run very significant, studies that are well controlled and well powered, and go through a traditional FDA process, and then of course the reimbursement process behind that. So I think there's a lot of challenges, and on the one hand, it may make access a little more challenging. On the other hand, patients can be assured that there's significant data demonstrating outcomes, right? Payers can be assured of the same, and then that whole machinery does have a phenomenal capability of delivering therapeutic treatment modalities to lots of patients across the globe, which will ultimately have a significant impact.
Thank you, Greg. And I have an open question for the panel. This is a somewhat self-centered question because I myself focus on intellectual property here at Zuber Lawler, and we're doing a lot of work in relation to intellectual property in the psychedelic space. How does intellectual property protection play into your research strategies? And this is, again, an open question for the panel. Are you looking at that? Are you focused on that? There are a finite number of compounds that we're looking at here, and there's an awful large subject matter in terms of the types of conditions that we're looking to treat with this limited spectrum of compounds. So again, coming to it, how are you looking at intellectual property protection in the context of your own research activities, and how does intellectual property protection and the notion of it play into those strategies?
I'm happy to jump in here and explain how Mydecine looks at intellectual property. So like was mentioned earlier, the process of clinical trials, especially, looking at the details around these other psychedelic compounds of interest, other, improved psilocins or psilocybins, like Greg was mentioning, is incredibly expensive. And so any of these improvements that we're talking about on the panel are also patentable material. And by having patents associated with these, pharmaceutical improvements, formulary improvements, et cetera, it allows for a business strategy that then will be able to actually put funds into that clinical trial program. And ultimately, we view this as a way of actually accelerating patient access to these improved versions of the current generation of psychedelics.
Thank you, Robert. Very helpful. Zayn, Greg, care to give any comments there? Zayn, I know that may be less relevant to your context, but either of you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in, Zayn, if it's okay. So just to add to Robert's comments, certainly we look at intellectual property on a very regular basis. We believe that there's a lot of intellectual know-how that will be patentable around both, use of the psychedelics that we're developing and the companies are developing for certain therapeutic indications, right? So use patents, of course. We think that, of course, there's an ability to patent formulations, no doubt, and then also through, different routes of administration. So our IP strategy is really focused on generating patents in those three particular areas that we think are highly innovative and will be delivering a lot of value to the healthcare system. We're also looking at regulatory mechanisms to protect our unique approaches as well. And there's several different opportunities through the Food and Drug Administration to begin with that may, kind of allow that. But certainly it's an important aspect in terms of how we're building our company, as Robert kind of pointed out. For sure, it's critical, especially when we're working to raise capital. And from an investor's perspective, we want to ensure then that we've got an ability to protect our particular approach. At the same time, I think that there's lots of room for many different companies to participate. We think specifically in the psilocybin arena that there's a lot of room, even given the current patents that have been issued in this space, that there's plenty of room for us to exercise our innovative approach to the area very easily. So we're pretty excited what that can mean. Ultimately, that just helps draw more capital into space, which then provides opportunities for more development, and then ultimately greater access for patients. So I think that's a good thing at the end of the day, and certainly there'll be more to come in terms of the final outcomes, in terms of which patents are issued, and then what companies ultimately do with that intellectual property assets that they create. But it certainly is an important part of how we're developing TRYP.
Indeed. Zayn, were you going to say something on this topic?
Really, for us, I think the interesting thing is how we use our digital platform to acquire, outcome data to develop, prediction scores that are going to be used in patient selection and, development of novel biomarkers that, ultimately guide clinical care. So a few things that we know about ketamine, for example, is that, it may have an anti-inflammatory effect. So those who suffer from neuroinflammation, have, elevated levels of inflammatory cytokines tend to do better. And we want to understand, when we're titrating this medication, what are we really titrating it to? We understand, like the psychedelic experience, like is really critical to achieve a long-term outcome. So we want to understand, how we're, what are the electrophysiological, biomarkers that we can develop, and consistently, dose ketamine to that experience, and what other factors are relevant in that dosing process. So the development of precision medicine is where our IP is really focused at this point. We use music. We've licensed over 1 million songs to be able to, augment the ketamine therapy. So, how all of that factors in, we have a machine learning team here. So we're using knowledge graph computing to map out all of the unique patient journeys, and we'd be more than happy to explore the use of any of the the compounds like discussed on the panel, and look at the efficacy data within our patient population. So we're really an agnostic patient care delivery platform.
Tom, I think you're on mute.
The dog was barking in the background, so I had to put it on mute, but I'm more eloquent when I'm on mute. So I think it worked out for the best. I do want to touch on one final topic. We are running out of time here, which I want to return to the parallels and the differences between the development of the cannabis industry and the development of the psychedelics industry, because obviously there's so much to be mined there, and there's so much to be learned there, and things that we might want to do different in this newly emerging psychedelics industry. One, I'd like to talk a bit about what are some more of the similarities and the differences between the development of the cannabis industry, including in the way that people receive cannabis products, as compared to the way that the psychedelics industry would develop, and the way that psychedelics patients and psychedelic product users will receive those products, those experiences. And furthermore, I'd like to do that in the context of microdosing. How does microdosing play into things? Does microdosing illuminate a path to a potential recreational industry within the psychedelics industry, or is that a little bit too much extrapolation? Is that really not going to happen? Are we not going to see a day where recreational psychedelics products are available to us here in the U.S. and elsewhere around the world? And that's an open question for the panel.
I kind of feel like I should jump in, because I think, Tom, what you're saying is that I didn't answer the question the first time you posed it. So let me take a second.
Not at all, Greg. I'm just saying it's one of my favorite topics. So
okay,
I'm returning to it. But thank you, sir.
Fair enough. So I would, I'm really curious to see what Robert and Zane have to say about this. But for sure, there's similarities, right? In some ways, although as you mentioned at the very top of the panel, it seems that psychedelics is really, kind of very heavily skewed or more heavily skewed towards the traditional drug development kind of approach versus kind of recreational use. But certainly, as you said, like if microdosing becomes a thing, right? If there is evidence that it works, and our approach, by the way, at the moment is is not looking at that, so I can't really comment, but maybe Zane and Robert can comment on that a little bit more. But certainly if that is the case, then I think there could be, certainly significant recreational or at-home, use of psychedelics. And if that helps patients, then I think that would be, absolutely phenomenal. On the other hand, in the cannabis space, the one company that I've referred to personally many times is GW Pharmaceuticals, right? That was, based in London, then eventually moved their operations here to Southern California. Justin Gover and his team had been working on that company for about 21 plus years, I think, before they sold that to Jazz Pharmaceuticals. And they had a very specific cannabinoid that they were developing called Epidiolex for pediatric epilepsy through a very traditional kind of FDA, pathway, similar to what Robert and I were talking about earlier in our companies and what we talked about here in the panel. But that was sort of one company where most of the cannabis industry seemed to be much more kind of on the recreational kind of front overall. So there's definitely some similarities, but also some very big differences. And certainly, lastly, we talked about this a little bit earlier as well, adding psychotherapy, which seems to be, kind of the standard of how ultimately the industry is going to end up delivering these therapeutics, was not required with cannabis, of course. And it was something that was, very different and a unique aspect to this particular, category of psychedelic drug development versus what we saw over in cannabis. So hopefully this time I did a little bit better job of getting back to your favorite topic.
Yeah, indeed, Greg, and thank you for that. And any other final comments on that from Robert or Zane?
Yeah, absolutely. So I see a really sort of big difference between the cannabis space, which I was heavily involved with years ago, and the psychedelic space and how it's developing. And I think it's really because the psychedelic space is developing in a drug development, clinical trial, clinical, prescription use type fashion. And I think it's an interesting question to layer over the microdosing application with that. Absolutely. And specifically because the medical data so far, the anecdotal data for microdosing is quite high, but the medical data so far, including by some of our scientific advisors, has been rather ambiguous. And so I think there's a signal there, but it hasn't been really, zeroed in on to an adequate degree. And I do think on the opposite side of the coin, there are definitely some regulatory concerns with, prescription use or even outside of in-clinic use of psychedelics, because there's questions that are similar to safety questions in the opioid space or other, drug spaces, where can patients abuse the medication outside of the designed usage. And so I think those are going to be things that are very much at the forefront of what you were describing and need to be addressed before there'll be, prescription of microdoses, sort of given out in a much wider scale out to the public in general. I also think there may be some side effect safety issues associated with chronic dosing of psychedelics that are outside of the scope of safety that would be for over-the-counter medication or a recreational product. So I think those are factors that will really play in heavily as the data comes in.
That's great, Robert. And I think we have to call it quits here. I would like to find out from our host if we have time for some questions from the audience. I'm not sure that we do. Paul, do we have time for questions?
Yeah, it's for questions. You can throw it back to me at 5 minutes to the hour. Thanks.
Great. So I would like to go ahead and open it up for questions from the audience if there are any. And I think there are some questions here that are on my panel. So I think we have time for at least one here. One is, what types of genomic testing are you currently using? And that's an open question for the panel here. Do we have any insight to offer to Taz and Khan?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Greg, go ahead.
I interrupted you last time. Please go ahead.
Well, we've developed a NueLife genomics panel that looks at the BDNF receptor, genotype that is predictive of antidepressant persistence. And there's definitely implications in adjuvant therapy and dosing recommendations. And we are looking at genotypes that are predictive of, like the intensity of the experience. And so all of this is going to be a multifactorial equation in the entire, precision medicine route that we're going for. So it's not enough for us to know that, ketamine therapy works. We want to know why it works so that we can, offer more personalized care plans. But yeah, there's a few, genotypes that have clinical relevance here.
That's great. Thank you, Zane. And I want to, I think maybe we can squeeze in one more question here, and it relates to compounding. The question here is from Sarah Markey, MD, Dr. Sarah Markey. And Sarah asks, when ordering, we find that ketamine is often on back order, and we have to purchase quite a bit of ketamine in advance. What's the role of compounding in alleviating that circumstance, and how do you address that circumstance in general? Is there any insight that we can offer from the panel here? There may not be, but I want to go ahead and ask. It looks like a reasonable and illuminating question.
I can jump in on that a little bit. We don't have direct experience, obviously, yet in terms of marketing our chemistries, so I can't speak to it from that perspective. But certainly, we've considered using compounding pharmacies within a couple of our university academic centers to help expedite access to drug for our clinical studies, right? So I think certainly from that regard, compounding could be very helpful, where we can send the API and then have it essentially formulated right there on site right before it's dosed to a patient. So that can certainly be very helpful. There are some other, there are some benefits of actually having a filled and finished product out of a more traditional contract manufacturing organization in terms of, consistency, for example, and also, different types of controls you've got around, protocols, release protocols or release testing, shelf life testing, things like that, right? That happen under traditional CMO, type of CGMP manufacturing processes. But certainly, there could be a role, and it sounds like at this particular juncture that compounding may have, it may have a role in the ketamine space, if J&J and their manufacturers want to participate with that particular route.
Thank you, Greg. And I think with that, we're going to have to wrap here because we are out of time. I want to give a hearty thank you to our panelists, Greg McKee, CEO over TRYP Therapeutics, also to Zane Hassan, Dr. Zane Hassan, co-founder CMO at NueLife, and finally, Robert Roscow, Chief Scientific Officer at Mydecine. These are our companies that are at the cutting edge of the psychedelics, the legalized psychedelics movement. And I thank all of you for the work that you're doing in growing this industry and this culture and this subject matter, which obviously has a profound potential to make the lives of persons better around the world. So thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you very much to audience members for watching. It's a very exciting topic and a very exciting time in the psychedelics industry. And Paul, thank you very much, sir, for having me on.
That was great, guys. That was, again, yet another in a series of recondite, fascinating, and kind of entertaining panels. What a day. We started with the FDA. We went to ketamine, and then we went to everyone's favorite topic, money, all in a really tight 3.5-hour format. I'm indebted to all of our content providers today, all of our 3 excellent moderators, all of our more than a dozen panelists for their insights and really their passion. And these are some of the builders of this exciting new industry. This last panel, definitely, just as the first 2 panels did, got my brain in motion, and I was particularly interested as a early stage cannabis entrepreneur in Canada, exploring this topic about the similarities and the differences between these 2 industries. And I'll share my thoughts. They're original and they're mine and only mine, but what do they really have in common? Number 1, Toronto-based investment bankers. This is maybe the most common thing that these 2 Venn diagrams have in their intersection. And quite frankly, many of the same entrepreneurs that got behind cannabis early are also behind psychedelics. Many big names actually have seen this as the natural path forward. We might say that cannabis was sort of not the Trojan horse, although you could say it's a Trojan horse, but like the battering ram that knocked down attitudes and allowed a re-examination of plants as a source of an ancestral source of medicine and wellness and spiritual exploration. So thank you, cannabis. I'm delighted and surprised at how quickly this has all happened. And as to the bona fides of a rec market, well, in Canada, we do have a rec market. I'll show you what I mean. I've got with me things that I bought on the internet from Canadian providers delivered to my home using Canada Post. This is 100 milligram capsules of a type of psilocybin strain called penis envy. So you might need the psilocybin to deal with the whole therapeutic issues around the name of it. I've tried it many times. 1/10 of a gram will give you a really nice sense of clarity and a really sense of calmness and even an adventure. You might listen more. This I recently purchased, again in Canada. So what I'm saying is it's happening. This is actually mescaline, and this is liquid LSD. So wow, what a world I'm living in, that I could purchase these things, feel that the supply chain is safe. I look forward to where it's tested and authenticated, but I also feel that the companies are operating in good faith, and I'm used to growing up in a non-regulated cannabis industry from dealing with suppliers that don't go through the authentication that we do as a regulated industry. So it's a harbinger, if you will, of what's going to happen, what's going to come. And we'll see how that all works out. I think you're going to see a lot of made in backyard expressions of this. I think Oregon's a really good example of how a state can chart its own path and lower the barrier to entry for a practitioner who really just needs a high school education, regulate the supply chain, and take the risk, if you will. So the practitioner will operate under a strict practicum, only these products, only in these dosages, only from these suppliers, and will trust at that point that humans have agency over themselves and need not necessarily interact with the big, scary medical system in order to do something that has been done for, 12,000 years, just fine. So I welcome that as a citizen, and I also think it addresses the concern that, if you will, big companies are going to create a keyhole that you need to go through, a very expensive keyhole, I may say, to now monetize a molecule or molecules that largely are generic and have existed and belong to the world. So this is fascinating how this is all going to play out. I think this was our most engaged Psychedelics Go conference since we started doing this, and I'm sure all the panelists and the moderators and the guests that attended and took time out of their busy day agree. There is, I think, another breakout session. Let me just check my schedule. Yes, yet again, our great colleague Joe Moore is going to be doing a follow and final breakout session over the next 30 minutes. Please join him. There's a link. I would be remiss if I didn't thank our sponsors who played a critical role in bringing today to us. That is Psychedelics Today, PsyIndex, the law firm of Zuber, Lawler, and Psychedelics Go. I want to thank everybody for their passion, time, attention, and intention, and I look forward to our next gathering. Until then, my best wishes.
Thank you, Paul.